They told you Virginia was a land of honor, rolling fields, proud families, and a history carved in muskets and sermons, but that's the story you were meant to inherit, one of pride, not of poison. In the year 1894, beneath the polished surface of Richmond's estates, something else was moving, something whispered about in closed halls, written down in journals that mysteriously vanished, and only resurfaced when men were already too broken to speak. The Holloway name was a name of respect, a dynasty of judges, politicians, and landowners who preached about law, order, and God. But in truth, the Holloways hid something so unholy that even the church refused to bury it when it surfaced. 2 daughters were born to the Holloway patriarch in the same hour, twins, identical in face, inseparable in soul. But not in mind. Their bond was not ordinary, it was engineered. Witnesses claimed that from infancy, the girls spoke in a language no one taught them, a private code of glances, whispers, and rituals. Servants reported waking in the night to find the sisters staring into the mirror, holding hands, chanting words that did not sound like any human tongue. And yet, their father encouraged it. He brought tutors, mystics, even traveling scholars from Europe to study them. The twins were not just his children, they were his experiment. He believed their shared mind could be molded into a force that transcended mortality itself. He was not wrong. By the spring of 1894, when the sisters were just 17, rumors spread of a pact, a vow carved into blood, signed not on paper but on flesh, a pact no man of faith could sanctify and no court of law could recognize, but one that bound them beyond the grave. The Holloway Pact. Witnesses swore that those who stumbled upon their rituals saw candles burning black, mirrors shrouded with cloth, and the girls speaking with one voice, thou, gh, neither mouth moved. Servants fled the house, refusing wages. The local pastor tried to intervene but returned pale, refusing to discuss what he had seen. And then the deaths began. Neighbors whispered of animals mutilated, of children vanishing from nearby farms, of hollow cries heard at night near the Holloway estate, and the girls, always together, always watching, seemed untouched, as if the darkness passed around them, but never through them. But here's the truth, you were never meant to hear. The Holloway twins did not just make a pact with each other, they made a pact against us all. You see, when a family like the Holloways makes a move, the town does not question, it obeys. Judges, lawyers, and bankers all lined their pockets on Holloway gold, but even money has limits when the air itself feels poisoned. By midsummer of 1894, Richmond society was already whispering. Some claimed the Holloway girls were seen at the cemetery after midnight, carrying lanterns, placing objects on graves, locks of hair, children's shoes, glass jars filled with something thick and dark. Others said the twins walked barefoot into the river and emerged hours later without drowning, their dresses dripping, eyes shining as if they had been baptized by something that was not water. But the most chilling accounts came from within their own house. A maid, Anna Morris, testified later, before vanishing herself, that the sisters kept a locked chest beneath their bed. Inside were items no young girl should own. Bones, feathers, pages written in a script that looked burned into the paper instead of inked. Anna said that when she touched one of the pages, her hand blistered instantly. She never touched it again. And yet their father encouraged it. He told the staff that his daughters were chosen vessels, and that anyone who interfered with their practices would be dismissed. Dismissed was his word. What he meant was destroyed. The Holloway estate became a fortress. Windows sealed, mirrors covered, doors locked at sundown. Servants slept in terror, and neighbors crossed the street rather than walk near the gates. But still, the twins remained untouchable. Until one night, a night that still stains Virginia's soil with whispers, when a young farm boy named Daniel Holt disappeared. He was last seen delivering eggs to the Holloway kitchen. His cart was found by the roadside, eggs unbroken, horse still tied. But Daniel was gone. 2 days later, the Holt family received a package. A return address. Wrapped in velvet. Inside was a small doll, hand-stitched, with Daniel's hair woven into its head. Its chest was carved open, stuffed with dirt. His mother collapsed, screaming. The Holloway twins, of course, denied everything, but witnesses swore they saw them that very morning, laughing in the garden, Daniel's leather cap resting on their bench. Virginia's polite society told itself this was rumor, hysteria, but those who knew, the ones who had looked into the twins' eyes, understood. This was no hysteria. This was the beginning of the Pact being fed. The Holloway Pact was no secret ritual of sisterly bond. It was a debt, and debts demand payment. You were told the Holloway twins were merely eccentric girls from a powerful family, that their late-night wanderings, their strange possessions, were nothing more than superstition. But that's a lie crafted by the same voices who've always buried the truth when it threatened the order of things. The pact they made was not imagined. It was not some girlish blood oath sealed in secret whispers. No, it was older. It carried the weight of something written long before their family ever touched Virginia soil. The Holloways had an imported library, shelves upon shelves of forbidden texts shipped from Europe, bound in calfskin, ink that glistened like dried blood. One book in particular, The Covenant of Reflected Flesh, was whispered to have been hidden from the church centuries earlier. The twins found it, studied it, and bent their lives around its instructions. What was the pact? Simply put, it was survival by exchange, a twinship that went beyond blood, beyond the womb. The text demanded that one body could suffer so the other could thrive, that one could bleed while the other grew stronger, that one could die. And yet both could continue walking. The servants noticed first. Mary Holloway would emerge pale, trembling, her veins showing like dark rivers under skin, while Eliza walked radiant, her cheeks flushed as though she had stolen the sun itself. Days later, the roles reversed. One starving, one glowing. One coughing blood into a rag, while the other danced barefoot in the orchard with eyes like fire. The family doctor was summoned once, and only once. He left the estate white as chalk, muttering that the girls' pulses did not beat in rhythm with their bodies, that their breaths did not match their lungs. He resigned his practice the next morning and fled Richmond entirely. But the pact was not content with flesh alone. It demanded witnesses, it demanded offering. That is why Daniel Holt vanished. That is why the townsfolk began to lock their doors when dusk fell, because the twins' survival was not drawn only from each other, it was drawn from anyone whose soul they chose to bind into their cycle. And here lies the horror that polite Virginia never wanted to acknowledge. The Holloway twins had found a way to cheat God himself, to rob death of its finality, to remain untouchable in a world where everyone else bled and broke. But cheating death always comes at a cost, and the cost was never theirs to pay. It began in the summer of 1894 when the Holloway estate hosted its annual gathering. Politicians, land barons, and bankers came dressed in silks and tailored suits, eager to bask in the Holloway wealth. The family wished to silence whispers of strangeness by displaying their daughters as perfect southern ladies. But perfection has cracks, and that night the cracks widened for all to see. The twins were seated at opposite ends of the long dining table, their eyes fixed on each other more than the guests. The chandeliers swayed from unseen draughts, though every window was closed. Conversations faltered. The air felt heavy, thick with a presence no one could name. Then it happened. Mary Holloway's hand began to shake violently. Her glass shattered on the table, crimson wine staining the white cloth like blood. Her body convulsed, lips turning blue as though she were being strangled by invisible hands. Panic rippled through the room. Guests leapt to their feet, women shrieking, men shouting for help. And yet, across the table, Eliza Holloway sat utterly still, her lips curling into the faintest smile. Her skin glowed with warmth, her breath steady, her eyes locked on her sister's suffering. When Mary collapsed onto the floor, choking, guests rushed forward. But before anyone could touch her, Eliza rose from her seat. Slowly, deliberately, she walked the length of the table in silence, every eye fixed on her. She knelt beside her twin, placed 2 fingers on her throat, and whispered something no one could hear. Within seconds, Mary's spasms stopped. Her breathing steadied, her skin flushed with color again. The girl who had been on death's edge a moment before now sat upright, blinking as if nothing had happened. The room was silent, trembling with terror. That night, many guests fled the Holloway estate before dessert. Some swore they would never speak of what they had seen. Others tried to rationalize it as hysteria, a fainting fit, an illusion caused by too much wine, but a few knew better, because they had looked into Eliza's eyes in that moment. They had seen hunger there, not for food, but for something deeper, a hunger that could only be fed by draining her twin. The pact had not been hidden that night. It had been displayed, flaunted, shoved into the faces of Virginia's elite as a reminder. The Holloway twins did not live by the same rules as other mortals, and from that moment forward, fear followed their name like a shadow. You see, what the world mistook for superstition, the Holloways treated as inheritance. Their wealth did not begin with coal or tobacco or land. It began with something far older, a seed carried across oceans in secret. The Holloway patriarch, Jonathan Holloway, had arrived in Virginia in 1819 with trunks heavier than gold. Inside were not jewels nor heirlooms, but manuscripts bound in human leather, scrolls blackened with soot, diagrams of bodies carved open with ritual precision. These were not meant for public eyes. They were records of an older order, the kind of knowledge kings burned libraries to erase. Among them was the book the twins would one day find, The Covenant of Reflected Flesh, a text written in cipher, its margins filled with frantic notes from generations of Holloways before them. The writings spoke of twinship not as coincidence, but as design, a mechanism by which nature could be bent, siphoned, exchanged. The Holloways had waited. For decades, no such twins were born to them. The family line carried wealth, carried influence, but never the precise pairing needed to activate the covenant. Until 1876, when Mary and Eliza took their first breath in the same hour. From the start, they were treated not as children, but as vessels. Their nursery was filled not with dolls, but with symbols chalked on the floor. Their lullabies were not hymns, but chants carried from the old world. They grew up under the watch of tutors who taught them little of scripture, but everything of sacrifice. The archives reveal one chilling truth. The Holloways believed themselves to be chosen custodians of an ancient system of control, and Mary and Eliza were not daughters in their eyes, they were keys. The pact did not begin in rebellion. It was not a trick the girls stumbled upon. It was a birthright, engineered by generations who had been waiting for the right pairing. The right moment. But here's what most people still don't understand. The covenant did not exist to preserve the twins' lives. It existed to preserve power, to keep the Holloway name untouchable, to anchor their dominion in Virginia through something darker than money or guns. Every smile the twins offered in public, every bow at a gathering, every hymn sung at church, it was theater. Because behind closed doors they were fulfilling a ritual older than America itself. And in the archives, one passage stands out above all others, a warning, a curse, a line written in trembling ink. The twin who breaks the pact shall not only perish but drag the bloodline into dust. By the autumn of 1894, whispers had already begun to spread through the town of Ashbourne. The Holloway name had long commanded respect, but respect built on wealth is brittle. Once cracks appear, fear seeps in, and fear grows louder than money. The servants who worked at the Holloway estate carried stories home in silence, only to spill them after too much whiskey. They spoke of mirrors covered at night, as though reflections might betray something too terrible to be seen. Of strange scratching sounds that came from the locked library at midnight, though no animal ever prowled those halls. Of the twins waking in opposite moods, one weak, as though starved of life, the other blazing with an energy unnatural in its intensity. At first, townsfolk laughed. Children dared each other to walk past the estate after sundown, teasing that the Holloway girls were witches. But laughter turned to unease when livestock began to die. Horses found stiff in their stalls, eyes wide in terror. Chickens with their necks twisted left in piles outside barns, and then people. Daniel Holt was only the first. a farmhand who vanished after delivering supplies to the Holloways. His cart returned to town, but he did not. Weeks later, two more, Martha Green and Elias Cobb, were gone. No trace, no graves, no bodies, just silence. The sheriff made inquiries, but his reports never reached Richmond. The Holloway estate, it seemed, stood above the law. Letters disappeared, witnesses recanted. The town understood without being told. The family's influence was not to be challenged. But fear sharpens memory. People began to recall the night of the estate's grand dinner when guests saw Mary nearly die while Eliza smiled. They began to recall the strange glow in the windows at odd hours, like firelight, but pulsing, alive. They began to recall prayers muttered by the Holloway's servants before stepping on foot into the house. And soon, the whispers hardened into conviction. The twins had made a pact with something not of God, and they were feeding it. A small circle formed in secret. Farmers, merchants, even a priest who had long refused to enter the Holloway grounds. They met in barns and basements, voices hushed, plans forming. They could not prove the twins' crimes, but they could feel their weight pressing down on the town like a sickness. And so the first seeds of resistance were sown, not by the wealthy, not by officials, but by ordinary men and women who knew that if they did nothing, the Holloway curse would swallow them all. But the twins, they already knew resistance was coming. They had read it in the book. They had prepared for it. The Holloway twins did not wait for rebellion to grow teeth. They crushed it before it could take form. It began with fire. In November of 1894, a barn belonging to Elias Cobb, the same man who had spoken openly about the twins, was reduced to ash overnight. His livestock roasted alive, their screams said to echo across the valley. The sheriff declared it an accident. The town knew better. Then came the priest. Father O'Rourke had joined the secret circle, vowing to confront the Holloways with scripture if law could not reach them. Days later, parishioners arrived for Sunday Mass, only to find the church doors chained from the outside. When they broke them open, they found the priest at the altar, alive but unable to speak. His tongue had been split down the middle, like a serpent's. He left town before the week ended, his silence more damning than any sermon. Mary and Eliza did not hide these retaliations. They wanted the town to know. They wanted every man, woman, and child to feel the truth. Resistance came at a cost, and that cost would always be higher than anyone could afford. Servants began to speak of rituals intensifying in the Holloway library, of black smoke curling under the doors, though no fire burned within, of chanting in a language no one recognized, two voices weaving together like a single, monstrous hymn. One night, a boy sneaked close enough to peer through the window. He swore he saw the twins standing inside a circle of ash, hands clasped, blood dripping from their wrists into a basin. He claimed he saw shadows moving around them, though the room was empty. When he told his father, the man beat him for lying. Weeks later, that boy disappeared. His name never entered the records. The retaliation was not random. It was surgical. Each act targeted someone who had dared to speak, someone who had dared to whisper. The Holloways were pruning the toe, and willpower, one voice at a time. And the message became clear. Silence was survival. By winter, the town had fallen into paralysis. Doors were bolted, shutters nailed shut, prayers muttered in the dark. Children were forbidden from speaking the Holloway name aloud, as though words alone could summon their wrath. But silence breeds desperation, and desperate men sometimes choose dangerous paths. Because a handful still believed the Holloways could be destroyed, and they were willing to risk everything to prove it. By the first weeks of 1895, the silence in Ashbourne had become unbearable. Families lived in terror of their own shadows, and yet beneath that silence a small ember of defiance still burned. It was Elias Cobb who lit the spark. His barn already turned to cinders, his livestock dead. He had nothing left to lose. He gathered the few who had not fled or fallen silent, the blacksmith, the miller, two farmhands, and an old woman named Agnes Cross, rumored to know charms older than scripture. They met in her cellar, candles guttering, voices low. The plan was crude, but it was all they had. confront the Holloway twins in their own home under cover of night, and destroy whatever bound them to their power. They believed the source lay in the library, the room no servant dared enter, the chamber where strange lights glowed through curtained windows. If the book existed, if the pact was written in ink and blood, then perhaps it could be burned. Agnes warned them. What they draw from is older than the ground beneath us. Books may be tinder, but spirits do not burn so easily. Still the men would not be swayed. Rage had stripped away their fear. On a moonless night they set out. No torches, no guns, only knives, hammers, and the determination of men with nothing left to protect. They crossed the frost-bitten fields, hearts pounding, until the Holloway estate loomed before them, black against the stars. The great doors opened without resistance, as though waiting. The hall was silent, save for the crackle of unseen flames. They moved swiftly toward the library, guided by the faint pulse of light seeping under its doors. Inside, they found it. The circle of ash, the basin of blood, and on a pedestal at the center, the book itself, open, its pages whispering though no wind stirred them. The men approached with trembling hands. Elias raised his hammer, ready to smash the first volume. But the moment iron touched the page, the house seemed to shudder. The air thickened, shadows swelled, reaching like fingers, and from the far corner of the room, two voices spoke in unison. Mary and Eliza stood in the doorway, hands clasped, eyes black as coal. "You think you can break what was written before your names existed?" The intruders froze. Their plan had lasted less than a heartbeat. They had not come to destroy the twins. They had walked into their trap. The men who entered the Holloway library that night never walked back into town. Their families waited, lanterns burning in windows until dawn, but no footsteps ever touched the frost. By morning, silence had swallowed them whole. But the Holloway twins did not leave the town guessing for long. 3 days later, the church bell rang on its own at midnight, echoing through Ashbourne like a funeral toll. Villagers crept to their doors, hearts hammering, and saw the glow of fire on the horizon. The Holloway estate gates were wide open, as if inviting them in. And in the courtyard, under the watching eyes of Mary and Eliza, the missing men were displayed. Their bodies hung upside down from the great oak tree, throats slit, blood dripping into basins carved with symbols no one recognized. Their skin was carved too, lines, circles, runes etched into flesh with surgical precision. These were not executions, they were offerings. The townsfolk stood frozen as the twins stepped forward, their pale dresses untouched by blood, their faces calm as though presiding over a holy rite. Eliza raised her hands and spoke, not to the crowd, but to the air itself, as if addressing something that hovered just beyond sight. The flames of the courtyard roared higher, crackling in response. Then Mary's voice joined hers, weaving into a chant. Those who listened too closely swore their own hearts faltered, their pulses stumbling out of rhythm, as if pulled by invisible strings. Women fainted. Men fell to their knees, covering their ears. Children wept as though they were already mourning. When the chant ended, silence returned. The basins of blood boiled black, and one by one the bodies of the men crumbled into ash, leaving nothing behind but bones. Eliza's gaze swept over the crowd. "This is what resistance brings," she said, her voice steady, low, echoing with something not human. "The Pact feeds. The Pact endures, and none of you will break it." The crowd dispersed in silence, no cries for justice, no shouts of defiance. Fear had sealed their throats. From that night on, Ashbourne belonged not to law, nor to God, but to the Holloway twins and whatever power answered their call. For the first time, the twins had turned their private rituals into a public stage, and every man, woman, and child in that valley understood they were no longer bystanders, they were part of the offering. There is a peculiar silence that descends when something unnatural occurs, a silence that is not simply the absence of sound, but the deliberate withholding of it. It hangs in the air like a warning, a pressure against the skin, a pause in time that unsettles the soul. And in the Holloway household, that silence had become a frequent visitor. Neighbors claimed they could feel it pressing against their windows at night, that when passing by the estate, even the insects grew mute. Only the twins remained untouched, walking through the suffocating stillness as though they were conducting it. What disturbed people most was the sameness of them. Of course, all twins share resemblance, but the Holloway girls seemed to erase individuality altogether. They didn't merely dress alike. They moved in exact synchronization, their footsteps falling as one, their heads turning in perfect unison, as though guided by some invisible metronome. And when they spoke, their voices wove into each other seamlessly, overlapping like a single consciousness split into two throats. To witness it was to feel something tug at the boundaries of reality, as if nature itself had been tricked or corrupted. It was their mother, Mrs. Holloway, who first whispered of their secret pact. She had overheard them in the attic one winter's night, their childish voices reciting phrases that carried the cadence of ritual rather than play. Phrases that spoke of eternity, of refusal to be divided by God or man, of a unity that would defy even death. She dismissed it at first, attributing it to childish imagination, until she saw the blood. Drops on their white nightgowns, smeared across their small hands, but no wounds upon their flesh. When pressed, the twins simply smiled and said, "We shared it." No further explanation, no fear. After that, objects began vanishing from the Holloway home. Knives, candles, pages from the family Bible. The twins kept to themselves, whispering in corners, their gazes glassy and unblinking. Their father grew uneasy, pacing at night with a shotgun in hand, muttering about something being wrong with them, but still he did nothing. Fear has a way of binding men tighter than courage ever could. And so the pact deepened in shadow. The sisters began to withdraw from the village entirely, appearing only at dusk to stand by the iron gate and watch in silence. Passers-by swore they felt pulled toward the girls' gaze, like moths caught in a web of invisible threads. Some claimed to have heard whispers that weren't their own thoughts, words dripping directly into their minds. "We are one. We are eternal." It was then the elders said that the Holloway twins ceased to be mere children and became something else entirely. The first real sign that the Holloway Twins pact was more than childish play came on a Sunday morning in spring, when the church bells rang, but the pew where the family usually sat remained empty. The Holloways had never missed service before. When neighbors inquired, Mrs. Holloway could only force a strained smile and claim the girls were unwell. Yet behind her eyes was something darker, something that suggested illness had little to do with their absence. Whispers spread quickly in the village, for absence is its own form of presence. Some said the twins had begun wandering the woods at night, their white gowns glowing faintly under the moonlight, their bare feet leaving no trace in the soil. A shepherd swore he had seen them standing on the ridge, motionless, arms intertwined, staring at the sky as though communing with something beyond it. He turned away only for a moment, and when he looked back, they were gone. Not walking, not running, simply gone. Inside the Holloway home, their behavior grew stranger still. Servants, too frightened to speak openly, described how the girls would sit for hours in silence, their faces pale as porcelain, their hands clasped tightly together. Sometimes, without warning, they would begin to hum, a low droning note that vibrated through the walls like the deep tone of a church organ. The sound carried through the halls, unsettling anyone who heard it. Even their father, a stern and pragmatic man, confessed to friends over brandy that the sound didn't belong in this world. And then there was the mirror. A maid discovered it by accident when she entered their room to tidy. The tall standing mirror had been covered in symbols carved with a knife, words in a language no one recognized. The girls had scratched their names side by side, the letters overlapping until they became indistinguishable. "We are one," it read. "We are one forever." When the maid tried to report it to Mrs. Holloway, she found herself unable to speak, as if the memory of the mirror had been stolen from her tongue. She left the house that same night and never returned. By now the villagers avoided the Holloway estate altogether. It was not just fear. It was instinct, the way animals avoid a predator before they can even name the danger. Children crossed to the other side of the road when passing the iron gate, Dogs refused to enter the garden, howling when dragged too close. Something had settled over that home, something invisible but palpable, as though the pact between the twins had drawn a veil between the living and the dead. Yet the strangest part was not the fear they inspired, it was the fascination. For in every whispered story, in every terrified glance, there was also the unspoken question: what had the Holloway twins promised, and to whom? The true horror began when the twins themselves started to speak of their pact, not in whispers, not in riddles, but in declarations that left no room for misinterpretation. Their words were not the fleeting imaginations of children, they spoke with the gravity of prophets. It was late one evening when their father overheard them. He had been walking past their door, glass of bourbon in hand, when he caught the sound of voices rising and falling like a chant. He leaned close, pressing his ear against the wood. At first he thought it was scripture, perhaps the psalms they had learned in church. But as the words sharpened, his blood ran cold. These were not verses of salvation. They were oaths, promises, repeated in unison, as if rehearsed. We bind our breath as one. We bind our blood as one. Death cannot divide us. The grave cannot hold us. Their father burst into the room, expecting to find the girls startled, guilty. Instead, they turned to him slowly, their faces serene, their eyes glassy with a strange light. One of them, no one remembers if it was Eliza or Eleanor, for by then they had become nearly indistinguishable, spoke with calm authority. We are preparing, Father. You should be proud. From that night forward, their behavior intensified. They no longer ate separately. Every meal was shared from the same plate, every sip taken from the same cup. They insisted on sleeping in the same bed, despite the spacious estate that offered them rooms of their own. More troubling still was their insistence on sharing pain. When one pricked her finger on a sewing needle, the other insisted on pricking hers as well, until the blood of both ran together on the same cloth. Balance, they explained, their voices perfectly synchronized. The local doctor, summoned in desperation, could find no illness to diagnose, but he confessed to Mrs. Holloway that he had never witnessed such a condition. Their pulses, when checked simultaneously, beat in unison, as if the rhythm of their hearts had aligned into one. He left the estate shaken, muttering about unnatural convergence. He never returned for a second visit. By midsummer, the Holloway twins had stopped addressing others altogether. Their parents, their servants, even their priest, all were treated as outsiders. The girls spoke only to each other, their communication eerie in its efficiency. Often they did not speak at all. A glance, a tilt of the head, a fleeting smile carried entire conversations between them. Outsiders would sit in silence, feeling as though they were intruding upon a world closed to human comprehension. And yet, the most disturbing evidence of the pact came when they began to speak of the future. One evening, as the family sat in uneasy silence around the dinner table, one of the twins laid her fork down and said, "When one of us dies, the other will not remain. We will go together. That is the promise." The other nodded in solemn agreement, and together they returned to their meal. By autumn of 1894, whispers about the Holloway twins had spread far beyond the estate walls. Farmers at the market spoke of strange lights in the Holloway windows at midnight. Mothers warned their children not to wander too close to the property. And the local priest, who once visited every family in his parish, quietly stopped calling on the Holloways altogether. The house had become something unspoken, a stain on the town's conscience. It was not simply the girls' behavior that unsettled the community, it was the aura that clung to them. Wherever the twins appeared, conversations faltered, hands tightened on rosaries, and eyes lowered to the ground. Children swore that when the twins looked at them, they felt as though their very thoughts were being read. One boy refused to attend school for weeks after one of the sisters fixed him with her gaze, muttering later that she had spoken inside his head without moving her mouth. The Holloway parents, once pillars of society, became prisoners of their own home. Invitations ceased to arrive. Neighbors crossed the street rather than greet them. Even the servants began to leave one by one, whispering excuses about sick relatives or better wages elsewhere. Within months, only two remained, the housekeeper, Mrs. Griggs, and the stable boy, Samuel, Both would later recount things that defied explanation. Mrs. Griggs swore that she once entered the twins' room at dawn to find the girls sitting cross-legged on the floor, their hands joined, their eyes locked on each other. The room smelled of smoke, though no fire burned. The twins did not blink. They did not stir. When the housekeeper cleared her throat nervously, both girls turned to her at once and spoke in perfect unison. "You cannot break what has been bound." She fled the room and refused to speak of it again until years later, when the horror of what followed demanded testimony. Samuel, the stable boy, told a different story. He had been tending the horses when he overheard the twins outside in the garden. They were speaking of death with a casual intimacy that chilled him to the bone. One of them, again, he could not distinguish which, asked, "When the time comes, will it hurt?" The other replied softly, "Not if we do it together. Pain is only for those left behind." Samuel swore he saw them burying something beneath the willow tree that day, something wrapped in white linen. He never dug to see what it was. The Holloway estate grew darker with each passing week. Windows once filled with candlelight now glowed only intermittently, as though the house itself had begun to wither. At night, travelers claimed they heard two voices drifting across the fields, chanting words they could not understand. Some said it sounded like prayer, others swore it was closer to a curse, and through it all, the twins never faltered. They moved as one, spoke as one, lived as one. Their pact, once whispered in the secrecy of their bedroom, had begun to dominate every corner of their existence. It was no longer a promise between children. It was a covenant written in something far older and far darker than innocence. It was the winter of 1894 when the Holloway Twins' pact revealed itself most fully, not as innocent vows between sisters, but as something that seemed to reconfigure reality around them. The season was bitter that year. Snow choked the roads, ice clung to the wells, and the town huddled together in churches and taverns to keep warm. Yet inside the Holloway estate, the cold carried a different weight. It did not creep in from the windows or bite at the edges of the hearth. It radiated from the girls themselves, as though their very presence thinned the warmth of the rooms they inhabited. Visitors, the few who dared, remarked that standing near them felt like standing in the aftermath of a funeral procession. Their eyes, once bright and girlish, had dulled into a glassy stillness. Yet when they turned that stillness upon you, it was suffocating. It was not the gaze of children. It was the gaze of a pact incarnate, a covenant looking through human flesh. That winter, the girls ceased attending church. Their mother pleaded with them, begged them to return, but they refused. "We already belong," one of them said cryptically. When pressed on what they meant, the other added, "To him who keeps the under earth." The phrase froze their mother's blood. She never asked again. Servants began to whisper of voices in the walls. Mrs. Griggs swore she heard footsteps pacing outside her chamber late at night, yet when she checked, no one was there. Samuel, the stable boy, claimed that the horses refused to graze near the willow tree anymore, pulling violently against their reins whenever led too close. The tree, he said, gave off the smell of rot, even in the dead of winter. Most disturbing of all were the drawings. Sheets of parchment tucked into books and hidden beneath pillows began to appear throughout the house. They bore crude but unmistakable sketches, two figures bound hand in hand, sinking beneath the soil, their faces serene as roots wrapped around them. The drawings were signed not with names, but with a single phrase written in looping script: "We do not end." By February, the Holloway parents no longer knew how to intervene. Their authority had evaporated. Even their fear seemed useless. The girls had grown beyond discipline, beyond reason. They belonged to something else now, something that demanded more than obedience. It demanded preparation. One night during supper, the twins spoke almost casually, as if commenting on the weather. "When the thaw comes, we will be ready." The words hung in the dining room like smoke. Their father dropped his glass. Their mother crossed herself in silence. Neither dared to ask what exactly the girls were preparing for. Deep down, they already knew. The Holloway household had ceased being a family. It had become a shrine waiting for sacrifice. The thaw came late that year. When the snow finally retreated from the hills of Virginia, the land revealed what winter had hidden, a soil damp, heavy, and black as coal dust. Farmers muttered about poor harvests, cattle grew thin, and in the Holloway estate the thaw was accompanied by something far stranger. The twins began to dream aloud. Every night, without fail, their voices carried through the halls, speaking in tandem from behind their locked bedroom door. They spoke of tunnels carved in darkness, of rivers that flowed not with water but with ash. They spoke of a figure waiting in the soil beneath the willow tree, a figure whose face shifted, sometimes father, sometimes mother, sometimes even their own reflections, but always with eyes empty and endless. Mrs. Griggs claimed she awoke one night to hear the girls chanting rise above the howling wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate, words she could not fully catch, save for one: together. She crept to the base of the stairwell, straining to hear. What followed froze her in place, the sound of two voices collapsing into one. Not harmony, not synchronization, but a single voice carried by two throats. She dropped the candle and fled to the servants' quarters, praying until dawn. The Holloway parents could not ignore the change any longer. They summoned the town's priest, Father Corbin, one final time. He was reluctant, his face drawn, his hand trembling as he signed the cross upon entering the house. He approached the twins with caution, offering them the sacrament. The girls did not reach for it. Instead, they spoke in unison. "We are already promised." The priest recoiled, his chalice spilling onto the rug, the wine spreading like a dark wound. He left without another word. Weeks later, he resigned from the parish and was never seen in Virginia again. Meanwhile, the townsfolk avoided the Holloways with a fervor bordering on terror. Rumors spread that the twins were seen walking the estate grounds at midnight, barefoot in the thawing mud, their hands clasped as they whispered to the willow tree. Some claimed they heard the earth answer back, groaning softly beneath their steps, as though something beneath the soil shifted when they passed. Their father attempted to put a stop to it once. He barred their window, locked their door at night, and ordered Samuel to watch the hall. But at dawn, the girls were gone. When the family searched frantically, they found them kneeling at the willow, their nightdresses soaked in mud, their lips stained black as though they had swallowed earth. When asked how they escaped, they only smiled and said, "You cannot lock what is already bound." The thaw had awakened more than the land. It had awakened the Pact. And the Holloways were learning too late that what had been spoken in whispers was no longer under human control. The Holloway estate in the spring of 1894 no longer resembled a family home. It had transformed into something closer to a mausoleum, where the air hung heavy with expectation. The parents spoke less with each other, their words clipped, fearful, as though speaking too loudly might awaken something listening in the walls. The servants who remained performed their duties in silence, eyes lowered, muttering prayers under their breath. Yet the twins seemed more alive than ever, their cheeks flushed, their eyes bright with a feverish certainty. It was during this season that they began to speak openly of the Pact, not in the privacy of their bedroom, not behind closed doors, but at the dinner table, in the drawing room, even in the garden. "Death is not the end," one would say. The other would nod, adding, "It is only the doorway. We have the key." These pronouncements unsettled everyone who heard them, for they were not the ramblings of children. They were the assertions of believers. One night, Samuel the stable boy crept close enough to overhear the twins beneath the willow tree. He claimed they were reciting dates of deaths from the town cemetery, the names of infants who had perished in the cradle, of wives who had succumbed to fever, of miners crushed beneath collapsing shafts. Samuel swore he saw their hands pressed into the earth as they spoke, and though he could not explain it, he insisted the ground seemed to pulse beneath their palms, as though answering in kind. He told Mrs. Griggs, who warned him never to repeat it aloud again, but the truth lodged in him like a splinter he could never remove. The Holloway parents considered sending the girls away, to relatives in Richmond perhaps, or even to a convent where their pact could be prayed out of them, but every attempt to broach the subject ended the same way. The twins would laugh. "No, mockingly, but with the eerie patience of those who know the outcome already. "You cannot send away what is already chosen," they would say. Their certainty was unshakable, and their words carried the finality of a verdict. By late spring, the dream spread to others in the house. Mrs. Griggs reported waking drenched in sweat after seeing the twins standing at the foot of her bed, their faces pale, their hands clasped, their mouths moving without sound. Samuel claimed he began to dream of the willow tree every night, roots wrapping around his legs, pulling him into the dark earth while the twins stood above, watching with serene approval. Even the Holloway mother confessed privately to her husband that she dreamt of being buried alive, her daughters lowering her into a pit as though it were a cradle. The pact was no longer theirs alone. It had begun to reach outward, snaring anyone who lived under that roof, binding them into its circle of inevitability. And still, the twins smiled. By early summer of 1894, the Holloway estate had become an island cut off from the world. No visitors came. The townspeople avoided the property as if it carried contagion. Even letters from distant relatives went unanswered, either out of shame or fear. The Holloways had become prisoners of their own bloodline, but it was the twins who held the keys to the cage. They began to dress alike, not just in matching garments, but in deliberate symbols. White linen gowns tied with black ribbons, as though in perpetual mourning. Their hair was braided together, a physical tether that forced them to move as one. They walked the corridors like specters, silent until spoken to, at which point they answered in flawless unison. It was no longer possible to tell where Eliza ended and Eleanor began. They had blurred into a single entity with two bodies, bound by their own relentless devotion. The parents, desperate, made a final attempt to reclaim their daughters. One evening their father confronted them in the parlor, insisting that the pact was nothing but fantasy, that they must put it aside and live as children again. His voice was firm, but beneath it trembled the helplessness of a man already defeated. The twins only looked at him with that unearthly calm. One said softly, "We cannot break the pact." The other finished the thought. "We are the pact." That night the house filled with a sound no one could explain. Mrs. Griggs described it as a low hum that seemed to rise from the very floorboards, vibrating through the walls until glasses rattled on their shelves. Samuel swore it was like a chorus of voices whispering beneath the soil, echoing in the hollow spaces below the estate. The family huddled in the dining room, too terrified to move, as the twins sat cross-legged on the rug, hands clasped, eyes closed, swaying gently as if in prayer. When the sound finally ceased, they opened their eyes in perfect synchronization and whispered, "It has begun." After that night, the servants refused to stay indoors after dark. Samuel slept in the stables. Mrs. Griggs barricaded her door, but it made no difference. The pact had crossed the threshold from intention to manifestation. Shadows lengthened unnaturally in the hallways. Doors creaked open without cause. On more than one occasion, family members swore they heard footsteps pacing directly above their rooms, though the floor above was empty. Most disturbing of all was the growing sense that time itself had begun to warp inside the estate. Clocks drifted, chiming at the wrong hours. Candles burned twice as long or sputtered out in minutes. Nights felt endless, as though dawn hesitated before breaking over the Holloway lands. The parents still hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the season would pass, that their daughter's madness would fade. But the twins were not fading. They were gathering, and whatever they were gathering for, it was drawing closer step by step, night by night. The house on Dumaine Street, once lively with servants, candlelight, and the laughter of the wealthy, now stood shrouded in a silence that was unnatural, oppressive. By the winter of 1875, neighbors no longer heard the sound of a piano drifting through open windows, nor the echoes of boots across the tiled courtyard. The grand house had grown cold, its shutters pulled tight as though to hide secrets that refused to stay buried. Inside, the colonel kept the doors locked and the curtains drawn. He prowled the corridors at night, candle in hand, his shadow stretching grotesquely across the faded wallpaper. Some claimed they heard him speaking, yet no one else was in the room. His voice rose in agitation, as though arguing with someone unseen. "You betrayed me," he would hiss at the empty walls, followed by a long, guttural silence. But the most terrifying whispers did not come from those who passed the house. They came from the few who claimed to have entered it. One servant girl, desperate for work, swore that she was lured inside only to flee before nightfall. Her story, half dismissed as hysteria, spoke of a locked chamber on the second floor where the colonel forbade entry. From beneath the door seeped the faintest sound, not footsteps, nor the scrape of furniture, but something like shallow breathing. Another account told of a doctor summoned to the house. He returned pale, trembling, and never spoke of what he saw. When pressed, he muttered only, "The chamber should have remained sealed." After that, he left New Orleans altogether. By now, the mansion was less a home and more a mausoleum. Dust coated the chandeliers, cobwebs laced the gilded mirrors, and portraits of the colonel's ancestors seemed to watch with accusatory eyes. Yet the chamber upstairs, always locked, always guarded, drew the imagination of every gossip and every child who dared walk too close to he gates. Some claimed it contained her body, preserved in a grotesque attempt at devotion. Others whispered it was not a corpse, but something far worse, something that moved in the darkness, tethered to the colonel's will, or perhaps to his guilt. Late at night, those who lingered in the street swore they heard a woman's cry, thin and muffled, floating through the shutters. The sound was brief, barely there, but enough to chill the bone. Was it memory, madness, or proof that the colonel was not living alone after all? The silence of the chamber was never total, and silence, as the neighbors soon learned, can sometimes scream louder than any confession. By the spring of 1876, the colonel's mind had begun to fracture in ways too visible to ignore. He was no longer the rigid, calculating figure who had once commanded men with nothing more than a glance. His posture bent, his eyes sunken, and when he spoke, it was rarely to the living. He muttered endlessly, as if in conversation with someone who lingered just outside the reach of candlelight. Neighbors described him walking the courtyard in circles at night, barefoot, whispering to shadows. Some said he carried a wineglass, half filled, offering it to the air as though serving a guest no one else could see. He spoke her name, his wife's, again and again, like a prayer or a curse. The house itself seemed to warp beneath his unraveling. Servants who remained in his employ fled one by one, unable to endure the sounds that came after dusk. The clinking of chains, the dragging of something heavy across the floorboards, the slam of a door in a room no one entered. The colonel, when confronted, only smiled bitterly and muttered, "You don't hear her? Then you don't deserve to be here." Inside his study, papers were scattered everywhere, records of old battles, letters from former officers, torn Bible pages with entire verses crossed out in ink. He had written obsessively in the margins, "Blood bought silence. The agreement cannot be undone." And most chilling, "The chamber answers when I sleep." Visitors who dared to approach the colonel found him impossible to pin to reality. One merchant, trying to collect a debt, later swore that in mid-conversation the colonel's gaze drifted toward the stairwell. His face softened, and he reached out as though to touch someone standing there, but the stairwell was empty. When the merchant cleared his throat, the colonel snapped back with a rage so sudden it seemed animal. He drove the man out with a pistol in hand, screaming, "You'll know, or take her from me again." His isolation only deepened. He boarded the windows of the upper floor as though to keep something in, or to keep the world out. Neighbors crossing the street at night reported flickers of lamplight behind the wood, and shadows moving across the cracks. One shadow small, slight, feminine, the other taller, hunched, as though carrying unbearable weight. What the colonel had once concealed with power and wealth now spilled into the open in grotesque glimpses. His descent was no longer whispered about, it was witnessed, and with every passing week the question grew darker, heavier, more dangerous. Was the colonel haunted by grief, or by something far more real, something the chamber itself was keeping alive? By midsummer the Holloway estate had become more fortress than home. Its shutters were nailed shut, the garden left to rot, and even the gravel path that once sparkled white with carriage wheels now lay sunken into mud. The colonel rarely appeared outside, but when he did, he carried with him the look of a man gnawed from the inside, his beard unkempt, his hands blackened with coal dust, though no fire burned in his hearth. But it wasn't his appearance that unsettled those who saw him. It was the way he tilted his head when silence fell, as though listening to something beneath the earth itself. More than one visitor claimed that when they stood in his parlor, they too could hear it, the faintest sound, like the rustle of skirts across stone, or the drawn-out breath of someone asleep in the walls. The house seemed alive, its timber bones groaning in places where no wind touched. The colonel stopped sleeping in his bed. He dragged a cot into the center of his study, surrounded by stacks of papers, broken crucifixes, and candles burned down to their bases. His journal from those nights, the few pages that survived the later ruin, spoke of voices rising from beneath the floorboards. She is there. Her steps echo through the planks. She wants me to follow. The pact breathes in the brick. Every oath bleeds back into the mortar. If I stay silent, the walls scream for me. Servants who had not yet fled were pushed past their breaking point. One maid, trembling, described how she went to deliver food to the colonel and found the plate untouched from the night before. Instead, she heard whispers curling out of the study door, low, feminine, overlapping with his own. She swore the voices were not echoes, but conversations. When she entered, there was only the colonel, his eyes wide, lips moving in silence as though finishing a sentence that had already been spoken to him. And yet, when outsiders asked what truly haunted the Holloway house, no two answers were the same. Some swore it was the restless spirit of his wife, clawing her way back through the pact he had sealed. Others claimed the colonel himself had become the vessel of something older, darker, a force that had fed on every drop of blood shed in his name. But those who lived nearest whispered something stranger still, that the house itself had turned against him, that its walls shifted subtly in the night, hallways stretching too long, doors vanishing where they once stood. And if one pressed their ear against the wood, they would not hear silence but a soft, endless chorus, like 100 muted voices praying, begging, warning. The colonel wrote one final phrase again and again across his pages until the ink blurred. The house remembers. Autumn rolled into Virginia with a brittle chill that sharpened every sound, broken shutters clapping against stone, dead leaves scratching across the gravel drive like bony fingers. By then, the Holloway estate was more myth than residence. The villagers who once came daily with bread, milk, and coal stopped climbing the hill altogether. They crossed themselves as they passed, whispering warnings to their children not to look too long at the looming silhouette of the house. But on an October morning, a stranger appeared at the gate. Not a villager, not a tenant farmer. He wore a long black coat, its edges dusted with travel, and carried under one arm a leather-bound book sealed with brass clasps. His face was thin, hollow-cheeked, with eyes that seemed too pale to belong to a man accustomed to sunlight. The villagers who watched from a distance claimed he did not knock or call out. He simply stood, waiting, until the colonel himself came to the iron gate, as though drawn by a leash. They spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. Words carried across the wind, fragments of a conversation no one wished to overhear. You summoned, though not in words. The pact must be fed. The house hungers. When the gate swung open, the stranger walked inside as if he had every right to be there. The colonel bowed his head, not in welcome, but in submission. For the first time, those who spied from the road wondered if the man inside was still master of his home, or if the house itself, or whatever dwelled beneath it, had seized control. That night, smoke rose from the Holloway chimney for the first time in weeks, but it carried a smell that turned stomachs, a mix of herbs, burning cloth, and something sickly sweet, like meat left too long in the sun. Flickers of red light spilled from the cracks in the shutters, and villagers swore they heard chanting, not in English but in a language that clung to the ears like dampness clings to stone. The stranger stayed for 3 nights. On the 4th morning the chimney went cold again. When the gate creaked open, only the colonel stepped out, paler, thinner, and trembling as though every bone in his body ached. He carried nothing but a small wooden box, which he buried at the far edge of the property beneath an oak tree. No one dared follow him close enough to see what lay inside, but afterward, the ground at the base of the tree turned black, as though poisoned from within. From that day forward, those who lingered near the estate swore they could hear a second set of footsteps echoing inside whenever the colonel walked the halls, sometimes slower, sometimes quicker, never quite in sync, but always close. It was as though the house had gained a new inhabitant, and unlike the servants, unlike the family, this one did not intend to leave. The wooden box was small, no larger than something that might hold a child's toys or a soldier's keepsakes, but the villagers knew instinctively it was neither. When the colonel shoveled earth over it, his hands shook so violently the spade clattered against the stones. He did not mark the grave with a stone or a cross, only tamped the soil flat with his boots, whispering something no one could hear. For weeks, the ground at the base of that oak seemed to fester. The grass died, the roots turned brittle, and a stench rose after rain, sour and metallic, as if blood had seeped into the soil. Some swore the tree itself began to lean ever so slightly, as though recoiling from what had been forced beneath it. Children dared each other to creep close, to press their ears against the earth. What they claimed to hear was worse than silence, a faint scratching, like nails dragging along wood, and underneath it, a muffled sound that could only be described as weeping. Not loud, not frantic, soft, steady and relentless, as though someone buried alive still begged to be heard. It was an old woman, the midwife, the one who had delivered the Holloway twins years before, who broke the silence first. She declared in hushed terror that the colonel had buried something alive, not an animal, not a man, but a promise. She said it with such certainty that the villagers froze, unsure if she spoke in metaphor or madness. The colonel himself grew more skeletal by the day, his eyes sunken, his mouth muttering constantly as though he were locked in dialogue with something no one else could hear. At night, the oak groaned in the wind, its branches twisting like broken arms, and those who lived nearest the estate claimed they saw pale shapes moving in the yard, two small figures circling the base of the tree, their outlines faint as smoke, their movements jerky, unfinished, like shadows rehearsing the memory of life. Then came the storm. A violent autumn thunderstorm tore through the valley, lightning cracking the sky open. Villagers, huddled in their cottages, swore they saw a bolt strike the oak on the Holloway land. The tree did not ignite, but its bark split down the middle with a sound like a scream. When the rain cleared and dawn rose, those brave enough to approach saw the box unearthed, pushed up by the force of roots splitting apart. Its lid had cracked. Inside lay not bones, not jewels, but cloth, small white garments, soiled and stiff with something dark. Baby clothes, dresses no larger than a doll might wear, and wrapped in one of them, sewn tight, was something worse, a human tooth, tiny, milk-white, a child's first offering to the earth. The villagers never spoke aloud what they understood in that moment. That the stranger had not brought knowledge to the Holloways, he had taken something, a part of the twins themselves, a piece of their life force, buried as payment, as tether, as lock. And the colonel was no longer master of anything. He was simply the keeper of a box that never should have been buried, and a curse that never should have been fed. By the time the storm had passed and the cracked box revealed its ghastly contents, the villagers could no longer deny what they had whispered for years. The Holloway twins were bound by something that defied natural order. The tiny tooth sewn into cloth and hidden beneath the oak was not just a keepsake, it was an anchor, a tether, the kind of charm whispered about in forbidden books, where innocence becomes currency and the cycle of blood is transformed into contract. The twins had always been peculiar, even as children. Born under a blood-red dawn, the midwife said she saw one child's hand gripping the other before their first breath was drawn, as if they refused to enter the world separately. They spoke to each other in murmurs no one else understood, and when one fell ill, the other paled, weakened, and coughed, though no fever burned in their body. To watch them was to watch one soul stretch thin across two fragile forms. What the villagers came to realize was more chilling. This bond did not dissolve with death. The burial of that tooth beneath the oak was not a symbolic act. It was a ritual meant to preserve the tether, to keep it pulsing even after one of them crossed the threshold. The pact had ensured that if one sister's heart stopped, the others would not beat alone. She would feel the death, carry the silence, and yet remain ensnared, unable to break free. Strange sightings confirmed it. Servants, before they fled the estate for good, swore that they had seen the twins in opposite corners of the hallways at night, one radiant with unnatural vitality, the other shrouded in shadow, her face blurred, her eyes unblinking. When one spoke, the other's lips moved faintly, as though echoing words across a chasm too wide for human ears. And yet the strangest horror was not their appearance, but the effect on the colonel. Each time he looked upon his daughters, his lips quivered with shame and awe. He called them his empire, his insurance, his covenant with the earth. To him, they were no longer daughters. They were keys, living and spectral, a lock and passageway to something buried deeper than coal seams or family wealth. The townsfolk understood then that the family's riches were not sustained by clever trade or good fortune. They were sustained by the unnatural preservation of a bond no human should possess. The Holloway name was not gilded by inheritance, but by a pact sealed in cloth and tooth, in cries muffled under the oak tree. And so the sisters, one of flesh, one of shadow, became both the pride and the prison of the Holloway bloodline. They could not leave each other. They could not rest. They were bound by a pact that defied the grave itself, and by a father who would rather damn his bloodline than lose his grip on power. The villagers could no longer explain away the horror. They had seen too much. The cracked box, the child's tooth, the twins appearing as mirror images, one of flesh, the other a wraith of shadow. And always, the figure of the colonel growing smaller in his own house, his voice breaking when he thought no one could hear, muttering to the walls like a penitent man begging forgiveness from something not human. But whispers alone did not account for the stranger, the pale-eyed man in the black coat who had come when the Holloways were weakest, who carried the book bound in brass clasps. Who was he? What hand did he serve? The truth emerged slowly, pieced together from scraps of rumor, forgotten letters, and the trembling testimony of a maid who fled the estate under cover of night. She claimed the stranger was no merchant, no priest, no friend of the family. He was a binder. That was the name etched into the inside cover of his book, a role passed through centuries hidden beneath different masks. His purpose was not to heal, not to comfort, but to secure pacts that should never be spoken aloud. He was, in essence, a broker of the unholy, stitching together the living and the dead with contracts written in symbols older than scripture. The maid described his voice as low, melodic, yet wrong, like a hymn sung backward. She swore he instructed the colonel in rites of tethering, guiding his trembling hands as if he were not a man, but a scribe transcribing a will that was already written. The tooth, the burial, the strange garments, it was all the binder's doing. He had marked the twins not as children, but as vessels. Their suffering was not tragedy, it was currency. And the binder did not serve himself. He belonged to a lineage of shadowed figures that appeared wherever power rooted itself too deeply into soil. Families of landowners, captains of industry, even king. They were drawn to wealth like carrion to rot, ensuring that the most ambitious men never truly ruled alone. Behind every empire there was a pact. Behind every pact, a binder. This revelation spread through the village like fire. The Holloways were not cursed by accident, nor by some quirk of blood. They had been chosen, marked, and guided down a path designed to end with their daughters shackled to a ritual too grotesque to speak aloud. And the binder, though he had vanished after the storm, was not gone. For every storm that rattled the valley, for every shadow that bent against the Holloway windows, the villagers swore they saw his silhouette return, waiting, watching, ensuring the pact held. The house was no longer a home, and the colonel was no longer a father. The Holloway estate had become a temple to a covenant no villager dared challenge. for they knew what happened to those who interfered with the work of binders. The body might perish, but the soul, oh, the soul was never allowed to rest. There comes a point when silence is no longer protection but participation. By the winter of 1894, the villagers had reached that point. They had tolerated the Holloway estate's shadows, endured the sight of pale figures at the windows, and swallowed their fear each time the oak groaned under the weight of unseen hands. But when livestock began dying overnight, eyes wide open, bodies drained of warmth as though life itself had been siphoned, they knew the Pact was no longer contained within the Holloway walls. It was spreading. One night by torchlight, a group of men gathered at the tavern, faces grim, jaws clenched. Farmers, blacksmiths, even the town preacher. Their plan was whispered, but each word carried like a gunshot in the quiet room. They would go to the estate. They would dig up the box beneath the oak and burn it, break the tether, end the curse, and free the town from the binder's hold. It was no small act. They all understood it. To touch the remains of such a ritual was to invite reprisal, but desperation outweighed caution. And so, under a moon smothered by clouds, they ascended the hill, torches in hand, shovels slung across shoulders. They moved in silence, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound, until the Holloway gates loomed before them like iron jaws. Inside the yard, the oak stood waiting, blackened at its base, its limbs stretched skyward in unnatural defiance of the wind. They dug quickly, sweat freezing against their necks, hearts pounding as their shovels struck wood. And then, the box, damp, swollen, split at the seams. But when they pried it open, the garments were gone, the tooth was gone. In their place lay something worse, 2 small dolls, crudely stitched, bound together with twine. Their faces were nothing but smears of ash, but their limbs were unmistakable, knotted, entwined, inseparable. And the instant the box cracked open, the torches hissed, flames sputtering as though choked by unseen breath. Then came the sound, not from the dolls, not from the oak, from the house itself. A scream, high, piercing, doubled as though 2 throats cried in perfect unison. The windows flared with light, not candlelight, but something raw, brighter, searing. The villagers dropped their shovels, some falling to their knees, others stumbling back as if struck. One man, the preacher, managed to lift the dolls. His intent was clear, to throw them into the fire, to end it then and there. But before he could move, the twine writhed. The dolls shifted in his grip, their stitched mouths parting in silent agony. His body stiffened, his eyes rolled white, and when he fell, his skin bore the marks of rope burns, though no rope had touched him. The rest fled. No torch could fight what lived in that house. No spade could sever what the binder had sealed. By morning the oak stood untouched, the soil smoothed as if no hand had ever disturbed it. And the Holloway twins? They were seen that dawn, standing at an upstairs window side by side, one smiling faintly, the other pale as death, both watching, always watching. By the end of that winter, the Holloway twins no longer seemed like children, though by age they should have been barely stepping into womanhood. Something in their eyes had shifted, something older than the house itself. Servants who remained swore they had caught the sisters staring into mirrors, whispering to each other without sound, their lips moving in perfect rhythm. Yet the air between them charged like the hum of storm clouds. They began to experiment. At first with small things, shards of glass, a dropped spoon. One twin would lift the object, and the other, across the room, would close her fist as though she too had felt its weight. Servants told of watching one twin's hand bleed after slicing herself on broken porcelain, only to see the same crimson appear on the palm of her sister, who had not moved. They were not simply bound, they were bleeding into one another, 2 bodies, 1 wound, 1 mind. But the most unsettling part was not their connection to each other. It was how they began to use it. The colonel had lost all authority, reduced to a hollow figure wandering the halls, muttering apologies to portraits and shadows. The twins, however, grew bolder. They learned the effect they had on others. The maid who lingered too long in their room would later collapse with fits, whispering the twins' names even as her lips foamed. The stable boy who mocked them in secret was found in the stalls days later, his hands twisted inward as though something had bent them while he slept. And still, the binder's influence lingered. Though he had not returned in flesh, the rituals he planted took root in their hearts. They spoke of dreams where he appeared at the foot of their bed, pale eyes glowing, urging them toward completion. The words unsettled even them, though one twin, the stronger, the darker, seemed almost to welcome it. She laughed when recounting these visions, while her sister wept silently, clutching her own hair as if to pull out the memory. The villagers sensed it too. They no longer called them the Holloway girls. They whispered another name, the Mirrors, because to see one was to see both. To anger one was to risk the wrath of two, and to defy them was unthinkable. Yet despite their growing power, there remained a tension between them, a strain invisible but felt by anyone who entered their presence. One twin appeared to crave the bond, to revel in its unnatural strength. The other recoiled, longing for separation, for freedom, and therein lay the horror. They were bound, but not united. That fracture was dangerous, for it meant the pact was not stable. It meant one twin might fight to undo what the binder had forged, while the other would kill to protect it. And in that division, the villagers whispered, lay the possibility of salvation, or the promise of something far worse. On the coldest night of December, the Blackwood sisters lay sleepless, staring at the warped ceiling beams of their crumbling house. But one of them, Amelia, was not awake. At least, not in the way others were. Her body lay still, her chest rising with shallow breaths, yet her lips moved, whispering phrases in a language no one in the family recognized. The others had grown used to it. Night after night, Amelia slipped into what seemed to be another world, her eyes fluttering beneath closed lids, her hands twitching as though she were holding objects that weren't really there. At first, her sisters giggled and teased, calling it sleep-talking, but soon the laughter faded, because Amelia wasn't just talking, she was describing things, events that had not yet happened. She said the chimney would crack, muttered Catherine one morning, pale-faced. And hours later, as they sat by the fire, a loud snap echoed, and soot poured down like black snow. She said Mother's mirror would shatter, whispered Eliza a week later. And by dusk, the ornate glass frame that had survived for decades split down the center, as if struck by an invisible hand. At first, the family thought Amelia's words were omens of accidents, strange coincidences, unsettling but tolerable. But then the whispers grew darker. She spoke of coffins carried through the street, of neighbors screaming names that belonged to her sisters, of soil being dug 6 feet deep. One night, Eliza shook her by the shoulders. "Amelia, wake up! What do you see?" Her sister's eyes snapped open, but they weren't her eyes at all. They were glazed, wide, unblinking. "I see your body," Amelia said flatly, "and your dress is torn at the throat." The words clung to Eliza like a curse. She stopped leaving the house, stopped speaking more than a sentence at a time. And yet, weeks later, her body was found, just as Amelia described, her throat marked by deep scratches no one could explain. The villagers whispered now, not about Eliza's death, but about Amelia. The sister who dreamed too much, they called her. Some said she had inherited a curse, others that she was no longer dreaming at all, that she was crossing into another place and returning with pieces of its truth. The family barred her windows, tied her wrists to keep her still in bed, prayed over her muttered phrases. But nothing stopped the words. If anything, the more they tried to silence her, the more chillingly precise her visions became. She spoke of names, dates, hours. She even began whispering about her own death, a fire, a scream, the sound of bells ringing in the distance. And as the sisters listened, too terrified to breathe, they began to wonder, was Amelia predicting the future, or was she summoning it? By January, the Blackwood house had grown quieter, not because the sisters had found peace, but because no one dared to speak above a whisper. The sound of Amelia's murmuring filled every corner, rising from her bed like smoke. It wasn't simply sleep-talking anymore. The words poured out in a rhythm, almost like chanting, as if she were reciting something older than herself. Catherine, the eldest, began writing the phrases down on scraps of paper. Her hand shook as she scrawled the fragments. Ashes on the wind, a bell tolls twice, blood in the rafters. At first she believed Amelia's visions were warnings, But when she pieced them together, line by line, they began to resemble something else, a prophecy. One night, Amelia woke with a violent gasp. She sat upright, her wrists still bound to the bedposts, her face pale as wax. "It burns," she whispered, her voice hollow. "It burns from the roof downward." The sisters froze. They had heard enough of her predictions to know they were not metaphors. Eliza's death had proven that. If Amelia said something would burn, it meant fire was coming. But where? When? "Tell us more," Catherine begged. "Where does it begin?" Amelia's eyes fluttered shut, her lips trembling. "The nursery, the place no one enters. It starts there." The sisters exchanged uneasy glances. The Blackwood nursery had been sealed for years. No one spoke of it, no one crossed its threshold. The rocking horse still stood there, the cradle draped in moth-eaten lace, untouched since the deaths of the twins. Their father had ordered the door locked, declaring the room cursed, and now Amelia claimed the fire would begin there. The next morning, Catherine went to the nursery. Dust coated the floorboards like snow, and the smell of rot lingered in the air. But something was wrong. The cradle was not where she remembered it. It had been dragged, scraped across and off the floor, as if someone, or something, had tried to move it. Beneath it lay a charred black circle, no larger than a coin. Catherine reached for it with trembling fingers. The wood crumbled into ash at her touch. When she told the others, panic spread. They begged their father to leave the house, to flee before Amelia's words came true. But he refused. "This family is bound to this land," he snapped. "No prophecy will drive me from it." That night, Amelia screamed. Her voice carried through the halls, shrill and desperate. "The fire comes tonight. The bells are already ringing." The sisters clutched one another, too paralyzed to act. Outside, the church bell sounded in the distance, not once but twice, just as Amelia had whispered. And in the silence that followed, a faint crackle echoed through the house, the unmistakable sound of wood catching flame. The first flicker was mistaken for candlelight. A faint orange glow danced along the nursery's locked door, trembling like a flame inside a lantern. Catherine, clutching her sister's hands, tried to believe it was nothing more than the reflection of moonlight. But then came the smell, acrid, suffocating, unmistakable. Coal smoke, sharp and bitter, seeping through the cracks of the old wood. Panic swept the Blackwood sisters. They screamed for their father, but he didn't come. He was in his study, and whether he couldn't hear them or simply refused to respond, no one knew. Amelia, strapped to her bed upstairs, shrieked louder than them all. "It's here! The fire has chosen!" she wailed. Her voice was not her own. It carried like a howl, rising above the growing crackle of flames. The nursery door shuddered as if struck from within. With a deafening crack, it burst open. Heat and smoke rolled into the hallway, curling around the walls like living things. Inside, the nursery blazed, not as if a fire had started, but as though the room itself had always been burning, waiting for its moment to be seen. The cradle, the rocking horse, the toys, all engulfed, yet standing upright as if mocking the sisters. The girls ran for buckets, for blankets, for anything to fight it, but the fire was not natural. Water hissed uselessly on the floor, steam rising like breath from a beast. The flames clung to the wood, fed on it, grew from it. Worse still, the blaze seemed to move with purpose, snaking down the hallway, curling toward Amelia's room as though drawn to her voice. From outside, the villagers saw it too. A glow lit the night sky, red against the cold winter air. Some claimed they heard laughter within the smoke. Others said the bell tolled again, though no rope had been pulled. They gathered in the square, whispering that the Blackwood curse had come alive, that the sisters Pact, it had finally summoned judgment. Not one dared to approach. Inside, Catherine tried to reach Amelia. She stumbled through choking smoke, her skirts catching sparks, her hands blistering as she tore at the ropes binding her sister to the bed. Amelia's eyes were rolled back, her lips moving in rapid whispers. "It consumes, it consumes, it consumes." Suddenly the roof groaned above them. A thunderous crack split the rafters, sending beams tumbling. Catherine dragged Amelia free just as a section of the ceiling collapsed in a storm of flame. The other sisters screamed as fire devoured the walls, chasing them into the grand hall. And through it all, one truth seared itself into their minds. Amelia had not predicted the fire, she had called it. As the family house turned into a furnace, the sisters realized they were not merely victims, they were offerings. The house collapsed like a cathedral of embers. Beams fell with shrieks of splitting wood, windows shattered outward in showers of sparks, and the once proud Blackwood estate became a pyre on the hill, its flames clawing at the night sky like the hands of the damned. The cries of the Holloway twins echoed through the smoke, first piercing, then muffled, then gone, until only the roaring fire remained. Villagers stood frozen at a distance, their faces pale, their breath misting in the frigid Virginia air. Some swore they saw shapes dancing in the flames, figures of women with flowing hair, laughing and screaming at once, their shadows etched against the collapsing walls. Others said the fire spoke, its crackles forming words. "It is done." None dared move closer, not to help, not to pray. At dawn, the house was nothing but blackened stone and heaps of coal-colored ash. The sheriff and his men raked through the ruins, expecting to find charred bodies, but when the smoke cleared, they found only fragments. A burnt ribbon, the warped frame of a cradle, the iron bones of a bed frame. Of the sisters themselves there was nothing. No remains, no bones, no proof that 5 young women had perished there. Rumors multiplied like the sparks that had lit the night. Some whispered the Holloway twins had been claimed by the fire they called forth, their pact fulfilled at last. Others insisted they had been taken, not burned but carried into the earth itself, pulled beneath the black soil as payment for secrets too dangerous to leave above ground. But the most disturbing account came from a farmer's boy who swore he saw them at sunrise. He claimed that as the last embers glowed, 5 figures stood at the edge of the ruins hand in hand. Their dresses were unburnt, their hair untouched, their eyes as hollow as the house behind them. They looked at him once, then turned and walked into the woods, vanishing into mist that hadn't been there before. His father beat him for lying, yet the boy never recanted. The Blackwood estate was abandoned, its land left to rot. No new house was ever built on that hill. The foundations, locals said, still bled smoke on cold nights. Generations later, children dared each other to climb the blackened stones and listen. They said if you pressed your ear against the scorched wall, you could hear the sisters whispering in unison, "The pact endures." What was the true nature of that pact? Was it madness? Was it ritual? Or was it something older, a bargain struck before their bloodline even began? The records remain silent, the clergy refused to speak, and the Holloway name was erased from polite society. But those who studied forbidden history knew one thing. When the Holloway twins burned, they didn't vanish, they transformed. And in every fire that followed, in every town where smoke rose too thick, too fast, someone always swore they saw 2 women in the flames, holding hands, watching, waiting. Because the fire that consumed their home was not an ending. It was a beginning. And some beginnings never die.